Hey everybody, it's Don. It's been about 6 weeks since I filmed a new episode, but I'm back and I'm here in Glen Helen Nature Preserve in Yellow Springs, Ohio to take a walk around the legendary pine forest. So let's go. Glen Helen is a roughly 1,200 acre nature preserve on the east side of Yellow Springs, Ohio. And I'm here today to visit a part of the nature preserve known as the pine forest. This was a 30-acre plot of land planted in 1926 initially with pines and some other tree species as an experimental forestry plot for Antioch College, who recently had acquired ownership of this land or management of this land. And so I'd like to take a walk through the part of the preserve known as the pine forest and talk about its history and what it looks like today. So let's take a walk through the woods and see what we see. Well, if we start on our journey at this edge of the pine forest, this is the northeast edge of the pine forest. You can look around at this forest in front of me and see that it's second growth, relatively young trees. There's some trees probably in the order of 60 to 80 years old, but this would have been relatively open land 100 years ago, or almost completely open land because it was farmed, pastured. I'm not sure if there were row crops in here or not, but nonetheless, basically open land. And so the 30 acres behind me then were planted with pines, spruces, and some deciduous trees that I'll talk about later as an experimental forestry plot, and just left to grow. All right, so if we go back 100 years, you see the trees in front of me, and what we're seeing first right off the bat are Norway spruces. Very common ornamental tree that can live to be 300 years old and planted ornamentally really widely. I have one in my own yard. A lot of people do. And at the moment, spruces are really undergoing trouble growing in the Midwest. Things like Colorado blue spruces, white spruces, they succumb to a series of fungal infections, fungal diseases that cause dieback, and it's really hard to grow a Colorado blue spruce to any size in this area anymore because things have just gotten too warm, too humid for what these species prefer, which are higher elevations, much drier, lower humidity conditions and so forth. But nonetheless, the Norway spruces are doing quite well, and what you see here is the morphology of trees that were planted at pretty high densities and were competing with each other through much of their life. And what a tree looks like that's grown like that is that they lose a lot of their lower branches, okay, because they're all shaded out, and they only retain their living branches and needles up high. So these are exactly what you'd expect a tree to look like when it's growing in heavy competition. You can see there are different sizes to these trees. Some are bigger in diameter than others. That means these trees, some are winners, okay? This one is basically winning, while this one is probably losing, okay? It's much smaller in diameter, and when I look up at its canopy, it's pretty weak, and it may not make it as these other trees continue to grow and outcompete it. So a lot of that happens. That's called self-thinning in plant populations, where they start out in pretty high densities, but not all of them can make it. They outcompete, or they compete with each other, and some win and some lose. Here are the needles of Norway spruce, by the way. Okay, they have long drooping branches. That's one way you identify them relative to other spruces. So let's take a walk up here, take a look more at these spruces and some other species that are in here. I've moved up the hill a little bit, and you can still see those Norway spruces out there dominating the skyline toward the east of where I am. But as you move up the hill, the slight slope that exists here, you get more into plantings of white pine. All right, so here in front of me is a pretty statuesque white pine, pretty small canopy, kind of, but still very healthy. Again, displaying that morphology of a tree that's been growing in competition for a long time. losing its lower branches and needles and retaining just the upper canopy, the part that's catching the light. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the fate of this pine forest because people remember it from 20, 30, 40 years ago as a complete dense canopy of pines and spruces. It was very dark under here. There weren't many deciduous trees, which I can now see throughout this area. And people thought the pines were dying, the legacy was finished. And again, you can see that there's a lot of pine logs on the ground. Okay, now what this really was just simple nature taking its course. This self-thinning phenomenon where there are winners and losers. Okay, they outcompeted. Some trees just simply got outcompeted and were starting to die of shade by their neighbors. But on top of that, there was a major Hurricane Ike, the remnants of Hurricane Ike that moved through this area, fall of 2008, that led to a massive blowdown. A lot of these logs you see here are the result of Hurricane Ike, which is now, what is that, about 18 years ago that happened. And, you know, the subsequent weakening of other trees that may not have fallen at the time, but got broken and still stood, that fell over the course of several years following. But, you know, these trees weren't dying, so to speak, of old age or anything like that. We had this massive natural event that knocked down a lot of trees. Some trees were getting outcompeted naturally by their neighbors, which has opened up the canopy. It's a lot brighter in here. There's more deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the winter, so it's not as dark down here. But in my opinion, as a scientist, that the trees that remain, the winners, so to speak, are healthy. These white pines that I see have very good canopies. They look exactly like what they should look like, for the most part, for trees that have been growing in close proximity and competition with each other for a long time. So I think the pine forest is just fine. It's evolving, obviously. That blowdown event did change things massively. It really opened up a hole right here, for example. You can see the big opening in the canopy. So this will now fill in with maples and tulip trees and cherry and stuff like that. So things will change, but the trees that are here are healthy that I'm seeing, the white pines and the Norway spruces. And those will continue to evolve and get bigger and larger. Both of those species can live to be 300 years old or more. I've seen white pines that are 5 feet in diameter and 300 years old personally in Pennsylvania, in some old growth forests in Pennsylvania. In fact, places I've profiled on this series, Cook's Forest, for example, in Pennsylvania, and Heart's Content. So as we get up here, again, these are more white pines. I think the largest one of the bunch is up in this direction. So rather than try to fumble around on camera, I'm going to find that and we'll get a measurement on it, and I'll profile what I think is the biggest white pine in the forest. Well, the tree in front of us wins, as far as I can tell. I measured 6 or 7 trees. It sort of stood out to me as I walked around. And this appears to be the winner, and if that changes, I'll let you know. So here's our largest white pine in the pine forest. It is 30.5 inches in diameter at breast height. All right, so I measured it about this height right here, around with a diameter tape, a DBH tape, and that's our winner. So if you want to know what a 100-year-old white pine looks like, growing in these particular conditions, again, with competitors, this is the size they can achieve. 30 inches in diameter or so. And it's very interesting. Like I said, I measured a lot of the bigger white pines that I could find. Like here's one in front of me here, here's one right here, and several others. They're very consistently similar in size. The big ones, the winners, they're all around 28, 29 to 30 inches in diameter. And so that's a fine specimen right there. A nice straight bole, again, B-O-L-E, word for a trunk. That would make a lot of nice lumber. And like I said, I don't know how much harvesting or anything was ever done with these trees after they were planted. in terms of this experimental forestry mission, which was the original intention here. But nonetheless, they got through many decades of just growing. Okay, imagine this starting 100 years ago as little sapling pines and spruces all in this area. It would have looked like a Christmas tree plantation for the first couple decades. And then things started to grow where the canopies coalesced, and it adopted that dark understory through, say, the probably the 50s and 60s, 70s, 80s. And again, there's a lot of memories of people coming into here to hang out and camp, and people have been married in the pine forest. There are many instances of that. There have been retreats. People come in here and do yoga and all kinds of fun stuff. And that was still really the case for a long time until it really opened up and it changed, and people sort of don't seem to do that as much anymore. I remember my first visit to this plot would have been about 25 years ago. And it still had that feeling. It was still very dark in the understory, filled with, an understory of a carpet of needles underfoot. But it has since opened up substantially since then. And again, as you can see, deciduous trees are creeping in here as well. So the nature of the forest has certainly changed. But for the most part, the trees that remain look healthy to me. So I think there'll still be a recognizable pine forest here for decades to come. Okay, so let's keep walking and see what else we can see. Another note about white pines, I'm not sure I mentioned, but again, white pines are native to Ohio, mostly to eastern, southeastern Ohio, not necessarily this area, but they are native to Ohio, not far away. And white pine is our tallest tree in the eastern US. So these trees can reach pretty close to 200 feet tall at maturity, and they can live to be 300 or more years old. And I've seen them at around 5 feet in diameter. So these can turn into towering giants. These trees here are, they're over 100 feet tall. 120 maybe or so. So they're no slouches, but again, they could grow 50 feet taller or so and twice the diameter of the trees you're seeing in front of me. So these things have a lot of time left, as long as they don't get out competed or blown down or something like that. But that's a little bit about white pine. Again, that's the state tree of Pennsylvania. Behind me in this spot, we can see what happened to some of the non-native pines that were planted originally in this plot. And let's take a look at what they look like today. So as I mentioned, there were pine species like red pine and Austrian pine planted in this plot of land. And those pines are not native to this area. First of all, red pine is a northern North American species in the northern parts of Pennsylvania and perhaps northeastern Ohio, but not this area. And Austrian pines, of course, are European. Both were planted pretty widely. In Pennsylvania, I remember red pine being planted a lot in restoration plantings, where, say, an abandoned strip mine was being reclaimed and they just wanted to get some sort of trees growing on it again. Red pine was one planted pretty widely back there. Although it's not very common in Ohio, at least these parts, as far as I can tell. Nonetheless, red pines were planted here. And Austrian pines are a big ornamental pine. They were planted quite a bit and still are along streets and in parks and golf courses and things like that. Unfortunately, both of these pines, which are 2 to 3 needle pines, pretty long needles, are susceptible to fungal disease called Diplodia shoot blight, and that attacks the stems, the young twigs and needles, causing dieback. And as you can see in this particular spot, where it appears to me that most of the red pines and Austrian pines would have been planted, they're mostly all dead. If I pan up, you can see the dead canopy, the dead crowns on all of these trees here. And that's been the fate of a lot of these pines, particularly Austrian pines. They've kind of fallen out of favor as an ornamental because they're so susceptible to this disease. So here we are in this spot where there was widespread dieback of these species, and I think this led to the idea that people promoted that all the pines were dying because they reached the end of their lifespan or something like that. There might be a little truth to that, but again, all pines are not dying in this forest, and they're not necessarily dying because they reach the end of their lifespan. They're dying because they are susceptible to disease and increasingly unfavorable growing conditions. Here's a spot where you can see what Norway spruce looks like when it had access to a little bit more light. So here's a Norway spruce in front of us that has a pretty full canopy. You can see it has branches from the top pretty much to the bottom. And when they're growing in high density, where they self-shade or they shade each other, spruces and pines, they'll lose a lot of those lower leaves. So if you see a tree that looks like this, you can see it's gotten adequate light from most sides for whatever reason. Here we're in a spot where there's more deciduous tree canopy around us. So it's not competing with a bunch of other Norway spruces, and it's well filled out. Likewise, these stand of white pines beside it have pretty full canopies as well. They have lost a lot of their lower limbs, as you can see, but they do retain a pretty full canopy up there, again because they have access to a little bit of extra light here in this deciduous tree canopy area. You know, this contrasts again to the pines we saw, the white pines, in the more densely planted part of this forest, which have lost most of their lower limbs, leading up to just a tuft of stems and needles near the top. So these adopt the more open-grown morphology here. Among the species originally planted here included pitch pine. Pitch pine is an Ohio native to more of the southeastern part of the state, or at least the eastern half of the state. Not so much right here where we are, but they were planted here, and a fair number of sizable individuals of pitch pine do persist here in the forest. Behind me is probably the biggest one around, at least the biggest I've seen. So let's just take a look from some distance here first. Pitch pine has 2 to 3 needles. They're about 4 or 5 inches long. They make a cone with a little prickles on the end of each scale. We'll see if we can get one out of the snow up here. But that's a sizable pitch pine. That's among the largest I've seen. So again, that would be a 100-year-old pitch pine. Again, if you look around this particular spot, it probably was planted, well, you can see the trees on the ground with pines that didn't make it, and so it's been growing out here almost in the open with some deciduous trees around it, but getting adequate light to stay healthy. Okay, there's one in the distance right behind it. Here's one up above me here, and I've seen others back in the other from the way I came. Well, let's get up close to this tree. This is a nice one. It's a big one, and again, the biggest I've seen in this spot. So pitch pine has these, I've profiled these on my series before, but these kind of like plate-like bark blocks. And it's called pitch pine because it yields a lot of pitch, tar. Here's some of its needles caught in the bark. Again, I've seen them in bundles of 2 or 3. You can see they're about 3 to 4 inches long or so. Here's some of the cones stuck here, and these are pretty old degraded cones, but if you look up close at them, they have a prickle on each of the scales. Okay, and then these cones will also persist up on the branches for a long time. So I see thousands of them up there, right, or hundreds at least up there. But this interesting morphology is a lot like what a pine in Italy I witnessed called stone pine would look like, with a long straight bowl and like an umbrella of branches and foliage at the top. So those pines there were known as stone pine or umbrella pine. That's a Mediterranean pine we saw pretty frequently when I was in Italy. I'll get a measurement on this tree, but I'm guessing that tree is about 30 inches in diameter. It's going to be my guess, and I will confirm that in my next segment. But that's our winner, I think, for pitch pine in the pine forest. Well, our pitch pine turned out to be 27 inches in diameter, so I was off by about 3 inches. Still a big one. That's a beautiful tree, 100-year-old pitch pine, at least. Now, while I'm in this little section, you can see I'm basically transitioning out of the area with the evergreen conifers to just deciduous forest out in this direction. But not a lot of people know that deciduous trees were planted here too in a plantation, this experimental forestry plantation. And those species included northern red oak, ash trees of different species, and aspens, I believe. So what we're seeing here are northern red oaks in this area. A lot of the trees around me are northern red oaks, and if you look carefully, you can see that they are planted in rows. Okay, and again, you have to look carefully to realize this, but a lot of the deciduous trees in this section, the western side of the pine forest, are also plantation trees, and they are rows. There are rows that you can distinguish which they were planted. So this section, this was part of the oak tree experimental planting. Now, I can't find exactly, what they did with in terms of the experimental forestry part, whether they practiced planting and growing techniques or harvesting techniques or optimal timber production techniques, because a lot of these things obviously remain. They were never cut down. I imagine some were throughout the history of this site, but nonetheless, this is the 100-year later on legacy of that experimental planting that occurred in 1926. I'm now standing in one of two fields that make up what's known as school forest. This is a Christmas tree plantation that's grown and maintained by a group out of Yellow Springs High School, and they grow and sell Christmas trees every year, and it's been happening for many decades now. I don't know when the first sales occurred, but the forest itself was started in 1946. And as you can imagine, we're right next to the pine forest, which is in that direction. Imagine the first couple decades of the pine forest, that pretty much looked like a Christmas tree plantation, right? So you can imagine what was going on, right? People would take Christmas trees out of the pine forest and take them home. So in response to that kind of thing, they decided to plant an actual Christmas tree plantation here. And what we're seeing part of that here, what you see in front of me are pines. These happen to be Scots pines that are being shaped into Christmas tree form. Of course, deer get at some of these things, right? But I've noticed as I walked around that they have grown throughout the history of this site many different species. Scots pines, white pines. I'll show you a young white pine. You can imagine what the pine forest looked like when it was planted. But these are Scots pines, which were a quite popular Christmas tree. Not the most favored at the moment, but still, people buy them. Okay, these are white pines though. These are young white pines. And here again, you see deer get at these things quite a bit. They break branches and rub their antlers and things like that. But here's a white pine, a young one. And you imagine in 1926, the pine forest looking like a bunch of these things. Interestingly, I mentioned deer here that impact these trees quite a bit. Deer would have hardly been here in 1926. So that pine forest, those young pines and spruces didn't have to worry about deer damage so much because deer were very rare in the early 1900s. Here's a spot where a deer buck rubbed his antlers and broke the feeder off of that one. So they had many decades of growth without having to worry about deer so much, which allowed them to grow and persist. But as you can see, if you look around any plantation like that, deer can do a lot of damage, either feeding or rubbing their antlers, continuously browsing them like this to where they don't really look like a Christmas tree anymore. But there are also spruces in here. There are firs in here. Yeah, these are the current most popular Christmas tree is Fraser fir. And I think that's what these are, actually, Fraser firs. These are grown widely and abundantly and are the most popular tree. Nice dark green flat needles. And they smell great. That's the thing. This is the smell of the holidays for me. When you break these needles and smell them, yeah, that's the smell of the holidays. So quite shapely trees, and the current leaders. So this field and the field you can see beyond makes up the school forest, and every December there's a Christmas tree sale out here. So you can come and buy your tree here, support the school system, the school forest organization, and keep this tradition alive. And behind me is one other species I'll profile I've talked about before. This is Virginia pine. This pine was not planted very widely here. It's was not really a member of the pine forest, so to speak, but it's planted around this area a little bit, next to the school forest, for example. And so Virginia pine, again, a native Ohio pine to the south and southeast. It has persistent cones, also with prickles, but the needles are short. They're about 1.5 to 2 inches long in bundles of 2, and they have a twist. And so you can see them here, just how persistent those cones are. These little short and twisted needles in bundles of 2. And that's Virginia pine. Again, you can see near the edge of school forest. And with that, I'm going to conclude this episode. It's good to be back. And so until next time, this is Don signing off. See you later.